To most Australians who have lived out their lives within sniffing distance of the sea, their northern territory is a harsh land, the dry bones of a vast continent. They see it as a land which a severe god had no time or inclination to soften with the verdancy of trees or grass. But many thousands of years before the white man came, Aborigines had settled all over Australia, but they were a wandering nomadic people. Most white men clung to the fertile coasts, but a few penetrated the interior in search of new horizons. Eventually, there were 100,000 settlers scattered over 500,000 square miles. To begin with, they were dependent on an ungainly animal, the camel, brought halfway across the world from another continent. And later on a remarkable man who flew an aeroplane up to the territory to look for land and started an airline. This is the story of how Eddie Connellan gave the camel wings and brought the isolated communities of northern Australia within reach of each other. White settlement began in the territory just over 100 years ago, after the great explorer John McDowell Stuart had crossed the Red Centre. He paved the way for the construction of an overland telegraph line from south to north, and thence to Singapore, linking the Australian cities with Europe. It was completed in just 2 years. In 1871, a large waterhole was discovered at the foot of a rocky hill in the MacDonnell Ranges, and it was named the Alice Springs, after the wife of Charles Todd, the Postmaster General. A complete telegraph repeater station was built, and from 1872, it became a self-contained community. Alice Springs was known to the Aborigines as Turiara, and the new settlement stood on the ceremonial ground of the Arunta tribe. Gun ports were thoughtfully provided to defend the station against an attack, but it never came. It was the harsh climate combined with an outback diet that made Alice a white man's grave. Postmaster Ernest Flint died in 1887 at the age of 33. Thomas Bradshaw was only 27. Keith Thomas, the ranger.
Bradshaw was one of the station officers, or the officer in charge that came here in 1899. And it was pretty stark country in those days. And I often think of how Bradshaw went and home to his wife in Adelaide, where they lived, right in the centre of Adelaide. And I often think how he went home and said to his wife that he'd been given a new post and they were moving out into the centre of Australia, 1,000 miles away from Adelaide. And I often think of what her feelings must have been and what he said, well, we're going to Alice Springs and it's 400 miles from the nearest rail point, and we're going to be travelling for 2 weeks by horse and buggy, and once we get there, the nearest doctor's going to be 400 miles away. We're going to get our supplies every 12 months. And it never ceases to amaze me of the type of the people that they were. We talk about the new breed today, but I don't think there's no comparison with these people, because it was only prior to the Bradshaws coming here, only about 20 years, before the first white men had came through here. And the population of the area, of this particular area that we're in now, was only about 30 or 40 people.
But in 1929, the railways staggered up from Adelaide and the settlement moved 2 miles south to meet it. A town like Alice was born, and the population today, 10,000.
Let me take you to the outback, to a place called Alice Springs. And once you're there, I'll bet you'll want to stay. It's the centre of Australia, it's the place that swings. So roll up your swag and let's get underway. Underway, underway. Roll up your swag and let's get underway. There are characters galore in Todd Street, Alice Springs. They'll spin you yarns to tear your ribs apart. Yes, if you want to have a holiday, that's...
Sir Charles Todd, Australia's Postmaster General, left his mark on the Red Centre, lending his name to the great watercourse which sweeps through the town and later the main street of the new Alice Springs. At each end of the town, Todd Street fords the Todd River, which is normally a dry, sandy bed. But when it runs, the town is effectively cut off from the outside world. All communicating roads and the railway disappear under 8 feet of water. Getting from A to B has always been a problem in Australia's vast outback. The camel was once an effective answer. In 1867, Sir Thomas Elder established a camel breeding station with 123 animals. These beasts, together with saddles and other necessary furniture, were driven up country by 12 Afghans who had brought them from Karachi. Soon, news of what was happening spread back to Karachi, and experienced cameleers began to arrive on their own initiative. These men, together with the explorer, the surveyor, and the stock owner, opened up the far northern tracks, camelways comparable with the ancient routes of Asia Minor.
The heyday of the camel in Australia was an estimated 20,000 camels owned by people in Australia. This covered the whole arid areas. The Afghans that came out with these animals in the early days generally used 70 animals in a team, travelled between 30 to 40 miles in a day, and they loaded between 16 to 20 tonne on their 70 animals. A large bull camel would be expected to stand up with 1,200 weight, smaller animals from 6 to 800 weight. They use these animals on the Strzelecki, Inaminka and Birdsville tracks very late in the piece. They use them also for mail carting over there. They had a coach with 6 camels in it, run on the Strzelecki track for many years. What time did they cut this out, Gil?
Oh, that was what, around the 30s when the transport took over.
Gradually.
And they sort of made a road up there so transport could get through, and then the oil companies come along, and now there's a fairly good road right through.
The Afghans that came out with these animals in the early days generally used a nose peg in them to control them. You couldn't put a bit in his mouth. If you put a bit in his mouth, you're likely to choke him down. He's got to bring his cud completely into his mouth before he can take it back again. Hence you had to use this little peg, peculiar only to camels. You couldn't put a ring in his nose like a bull. If you did, you're likely to tear it out. He eats out of trees like a giraffe. He's a tree eater, not a grass eater. The old Afghans in the early days travelled between 25 and 30 miles a day on their camels, and they walked every inch of the way. If the camels walked 25 miles, they'd probably walk about 40, because the big packs on these animals were never girthed to them. And if you girthed it to him and he stumbled, you're likely to break his bones. Hence the old Afghan had to walk up and down along the packs and adjust these saddles. It was all part of their job. I've seen some big loads, or there's been records of big loads on camels. In Mari in 1910, 2 Afghans had a bet to see which had the best camel, and one stood up with 1.5 tons on his back. Took 3 steps and fell over, but he still won the bet for the old Afghan. Gul here is one of the last surviving Afghans in our district. Gul's father came out in 1873 to work on the telegraph line with camels. He didn't die till 1940. Gul carried on the same business on the Inaminka, Strzelecki and Birdsville tracks right up until the 30s, and then spent 30 years in the Commonwealth Railways. He's back with camels now. I don't know whether he's going forward or backwards, but we're very pleased to have him around. It's people like the 2 Mr. Muhammad's that teach us all about camels, all our knowledge now, and I suppose we'd have as much knowledge as anyone in the world, but it all comes from these old-timers.
And the camel today, relegated to giving tourists and children rides. And incredibly, they've become one of Australia's most unlikely exports, being sent to the Middle East oil states to improve the breed of the native animal, because in Australia, the camel thrived.
Push, push. They are.
When Eddie Connellan came to the territory in 1938, camels still carried the mail. He flew up in an open Spartan biplane to make a private survey of the country, hoping to find a piece of land to settle. During 3 months, Connellan covered 40,000 miles in an ancient plain without adequate landing grounds, no engineering assistance, and across some of the world's most arid countryside. After the epic flight, the then Minister for the Interior suggested that Connellan might organize an airmail service to remote settlements throughout the territory. Connellan accepted the challenge, and from 1939, he built up a service of regular scheduled flights in a country that boasted no airstrips and scorching temperatures for most of the year, which seriously affected airplanes of that period. Last year, over a service area equivalent to a sizable chunk of Europe, Connellan Airways flew 1.5 million miles between 120 remote settlements and towns. 300 miles west of Alice Springs, at Nawituma, Connellan also built up a cattle station of 1,070 square miles with 9,000 head of cattle, where once there was only a wilderness. Commuting by aircraft to Alice Springs to run the airline, Connellan, at 64, worked 7 days a week. Right from the beginning, Eddie Connellan believed that Australia couldn't hold on to the territory without an adequate population. In the early 40s, he wrote, "We need people up here. There's plenty of opportunity, wonderful cattle country, but there must be some of the amenities of life. Only aircraft can bring those amenities and maintain communications economically."
Okay, Christopher, check, call, anything fresh?
With over 1,000 square miles to farm, Connellan keeps in touch with his family and his office by radio. The cattle station is a microcosm of the whole territory. Communications are vital for survival.
The townies managed to get the grader, or do we just have to wait till they call us, over?
Connellan is well used to the isolation of the centre, the never-never of space and endless time, the swagman's lunch of damper and boiling up the billy. 40 years ago, he was doing exactly the same thing, but in a rather more elegant vehicle, surveying the desert in a Silver Ghost Rolls-Royce. In the early days, Connellan's aeroplanes created quite a stir, and a crowd gathered wherever there was a crowd to gather. But for most of the time, it was learning how to fly and land in aeroplanes designed for a more temperate climate.
Well, to get the airline started, I had, of course, already done all the necessary route surveys and made maps. For many years, all the pilots made their own maps. It was a required part of their training because the act of making the map taught you the country and helped you to remember landmarks, which you had to put on a piece of paper and describe, as well as positioning them. And we built the hangar ourselves, none of us being builders, and we built the aerodromes. We went out with the old Silver Ghost Rolls-Royce, which would go anywhere in the desert. We carried a dismantled Britstand grader in the back. We used a 200-foot cable to pull the trees out. We'd cut the roots around the trees and then drive off, get up to about 50 miles an hour at the end of the cable length, rip the tree out, keep going to take it off the aerodrome. And when the aerodrome site was cleared, we'd assemble the grader and we'd use the 1919 Silver Ghost as a tractor to pull the grader by slipping the clutch, because you had infinite gearing. It was an oil clutch and you could slip the clutch, and as long as you knew that when the blue smoke started coming out of the clutch housing, you had to stop and put some more oil in, it didn't do any harm at all. Well, during this period, we built 7 station aerodromes and 8 emergency aerodromes. The emergency aerodromes had 2 purposes. One was somewhere to land in the event of some sort of trouble, engine trouble or navigational trouble. Dust storms, for instance, were a great hazard in those days. Sometimes we had to go to places where there was no aerodrome. One stage we kept an ex-Air Force ambulance Tiger Moth for the purpose of doing this sort of thing. That's after World War II now that I'm talking about. And George Taylor, for instance, took the Tiger out on one occasion on a medical flight for a stockman who'd been thrown from his horse and badly injured, out bush, not near any aerodrome, and it was considered unsafe to move him, and he just landed in the bush right alongside of him, put him on the stretcher and brought him straight back in the Tiger.
The airline operated from this single hangar on the edge of town, but Alice Springs grew to engulf the aerodrome, and a new airport was built south of the MacDonnell Ranges. Connellan's airstrip became a runway for more mundane vehicles. The new aerodrome provided an opportunity to enlarge the whole operation and to build the most sophisticated aircraft workshops in the outback. The mail run by aircraft, the service that put Connellan into business almost 40 years ago, still runs today over the old camel routes to Haast's Bluff, Papunya and Vaughan Springs. But today the postman is a pretty girl in her 20s. Jan Stiles came up to Alice Springs in 1972 and worked with the airline as a cabin attendant on the long passenger routes. She spent so much time badgering the pilots on the flight deck and neglecting her passengers that it was learn to fly or else. She qualified as a pilot in under 3 years.
Uniform Papa Victor, request OS clearance.
Uniform Papa Victor, good morning, this is Alice Tower. Hello, Jan. Clear taxi runway 12, wind 120 degrees, 5 to 10, QNH 1009er, time 10.5.
Uniform Papa Victor.
Many things have changed in 40 years. Air traffic control at Alice Springs and up-to-date aircraft. But the climate remains unpredictable, and the old problem of high temperature and density altitude, in this case thin air, means a longer than average takeoff run. There are few navigation aids when you fly off the beaten air lanes and the ground below still looks like the moon. How do you find your way around when some of it looks like all of it?
I have more trouble going down south and trying to navigate down there where there's a town every 2 or 3 miles than up here where you might have one town every 200. And of course, if you see a building shining, well, it more or less has to be that town. We have very few navigation aids up here. And after you've been flying up in this area for a while, you certainly get to know the country. In fact, you could almost shut your eyes and fly on for another half an hour and look down and say, oh yes, I know where I am, and all you might see is just a creek or even a clay pan. But certainly it is quite dangerous flying up in this country, especially if you don't carry emergency rations and water, because you just never know when you might go down. Sometimes we were flying almost up to 6 hours without a refueling stop, and of course one always wonders just where you'd put the aircraft if you did have an engine failure, and I think that on the whole, this country up here is fairly good for engine failures because we haven't very many mountain ranges that pose problems, and most of the scrub is fairly light sort of stuff that I wouldn't like to try it myself, but I think you could probably put an aeroplane down in some of this scrub. I'm fairly certain, of course, you'd bend the aeroplane. But I think you stand a fairly good chance, certainly in coastal areas where you have high mountain ranges. There's virtually no hope at all.
In the early years of our operation, one of our problems was to train the station people to something that they had no previous experience of doing. Handling the arrival of a scheduled mail plane, being at the aerodrome on time, not delaying it, not keeping it waiting. We worked to a very strict tolerance. I myself and later my pilots were not allowed to arrive anywhere more than 10 minutes ahead of scheduled time or more than 5 minutes after. And except in the case of a breakdown, and then the message that went around was that the service was cancelled or put off 24 hours or something specific, but the new times were given, so we had a new scheduled time to work to. Now we had to train them to this sort of thing. We had to train them to maintain their aerodromes. We couldn't get them to read anything. We'd send them stuff in the post and we'd find that they didn't know a word that was in it. They'd thrown it out without opening the envelope. So we devised this booklet, which was printed on toilet paper and had a hole in it with an arrow saying, please insert string and hang in reading room. The reading room being the little building out the back of the homestead, where everybody has to go at least once a day. It says it is a condition of our service to any station that all personnel are supplied with copies of this booklet. All pages printed on one side only and perforated for your protection and convenience. No lead poisoning.
Most people up here certainly look forward to having a visit from the mail plane or from a plane, whether you carry mail or not, because of isolation. Because sometimes they'll go on for 2 or 3 weeks, if not months, without seeing a soul. And they certainly look forward to a friendly chat and all the local gossip, which most of us seem to have.
Jan Stiles completes her mail run to Vaughan Springs, delivering mail to the middle of nowhere. Nothing much to see, but it's the centre of a cattle station larger than the whole of Yorkshire. To meet the plane, Sue Coppock. What's it like to have a whole county all to yourself?
Well, actually, I think it's beautiful because I don't have to worry about, I can't stand living in town anyway, so that wouldn't loneliness doesn't worry me. It doesn't worry the children. I think they get enough company. And, well, actually, we're quite lucky because Barb and Wally fly into town at least once a week. We're always in contact with people. Such a busy place here. Bushfires and that, we're always busy.
How big is it?
2,800 square miles. It's quite a big place. It's the biggest one around here. That's probably the most prosperous too for the area.
How many head of cattle do you have on there?
Well, about 7,000, could be more. Probably is more. Not actually really sure on that. I wouldn't give a definite answer.
What do you miss most living out here?
My family, my own family. No, not the outings or anything, don't miss that. Really nothing, I don't think. Sick, if the children get sick, that's what worries me most. Probably worries most people. But we've been quite lucky, they never get sick. So.
What would you do if they did get sick?
Oh, well, Barb would fly us in, or a flying doctor would come out. Or get on the wireless first and find out what's what. But, otherwise, we're all quite fit and healthy.
And you reckon it's a good life?
Oh, yes, I wouldn't go anywhere else. Actually, I've only lived up here for about 6 years. Still wouldn't give it away for anything.
The climate in the dead heart of Australia has in recent years undergone a change. The red centre has turned green. They still talk of the 10-year drought in the 60s, but the 70s brought unprecedented rainfall. The northern coastal monsoon stretched out further south than it had ever done before. Lightning strikes, and bushfires immediately spread across hundreds of miles of new pasture. Nature claims back the red, useless desert until the next rainfall, and the extraordinary cycle repeats. Sometimes a lonely bush road will act as a firebreak. Sometimes the rain will quench the flames. The landscape resembles a vast patchwork quilt in green and red. 300 miles southwest of Alice Springs lies Uluru, where once the first Australians paid homage to their gods. There's nothing remotely like it anywhere in the world. It's the last whittled-down remnant of a mountain range that once towered almost as high as the Himalayas. An explorer, Giles, was the first white man to set eyes on the gigantic monolith in 1872. Another, Goss, reached it in 1873 and named it Ayers Rock. The Uluru Aborigines, the last of whom left the area over 50 years ago, pictured their world on the mountain that symbolized their tribe and held the essence of life in the rock pools around its base. The Aborigines have gone, but Ayers Rock remains.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing at Ayers Rock in a few minutes. Ask that you fasten your seatbelts now and extinguish any cigarettes before landing.
The first aircraft officially to land at Ayers Rock was a Cessna piloted by Eddie Connellan on April the 20th, 1958. The event was duly photographed and recorded in the Rock's history. But exactly 20 years earlier, in 1938, Connellan, in typical fashion, paid the Rock an unofficial visit.
I was the first one to land an aeroplane right at Ayers Rock. Pat Hall had landed one about 5 miles away a couple of years before that. But I landed right alongside the Rock, and I spent 2 days there on my own with a tomahawk, which is the heaviest weapon I could carry in the Spartan for this purpose of clearing takeoff runways. And I cleared a runway through the trees to take off, but on takeoff, just after I left the ground, one wheel, the starboard wheel, hit a tussock and turned the aeroplane And instead of going through the tunnel in the trees that I'd cleared, I had to go through the trees. And I stayed in the air, but I collected a branch about as thick as your arm and about 10 feet long and took it with me and arrived back at Hermannsburg Mission with this branch of a tree waving itself out of the wing. It had gone back into the wing as far as the main spar and stopped there without breaking the main spar. It was one of the things that happened that could have been the end of the story, and I wouldn't have been found for goodness knows how long.
Ayers Rock is no longer isolated, no longer a sacred place for wandering Aborigines. Since Eddie Connellan's flight, the build-up of aircraft arrivals has kept pace with the increase in visitors, and thousands of tourists make the statutory pilgrimage there every year.
Welcome to Ayers Rock, everybody. I hope you all know that this is a national park. National park of 487 square miles, and it once used to belong to the reserved area of the Aboriginals, the Petermans Reserve. And in 1958, this section was dedicated to the Northern Territory Reserves Board as National Park cum Tourist Resort. And of course, the tourist population has rapidly increased over the past years. Nowadays, it's between the 50 and the 60,000 a year. So I'd like to ask you to help us, because a lot of people have been here and done a lot of damage, destroyed the paintings and the flora and the fauna. So I'd like to protect it. Thank you.
Big tourist schemes often crowd out the original inhabitants. At Ayers Rock, the Aborigines had already left before the first tourists arrived on the scene. And sadly today, Aborigines are not encouraged in the area. In fact, they're actively encouraged to stay away. They're seen as unsympathetic to the environment. Connellan Airways in the 70s has become Connair, Australia's smallest licensed airline. And Ayers Rock, a useful staging and refueling post for deeper excursions to remote settlements bordering on the Simpson Desert.
1002, and Charlie Whiskey and Delta Hotel Alpha are both on the ground at Armada.
Charlie Lima Yankee. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're climbing a cruise at an altitude of 5,500 feet. On our way to Armada, you will be able to see the settlement.
Christine Davey, once Australian skiing champion, is Connair's senior captain.
I started flying up here in 1963, I think. June 1963. I stayed here, I think, partly because I enjoyed it, and partly because there's very few opportunities in other airlines in Australia for women to work. At least there has been up until now. I think it's still the old prejudice against women. But I think it's rapidly dying out now, and I think very shortly there will be a lot more women in major airlines. I far more enjoy flying mail flights and stations out, at least trips out to the stations and settlements, than I do, just for argument's sake, flying tourists to Ayers Rock or something. Because I think when you're carrying essential things, you feel as though you're doing something constructive.
No, we've got an awful lot for you. Have you got some hoppers?
Over 30 years ago, Eddie Connellan solemnly declared, "My aircraft will fly anywhere where there is a single white woman in the north." It's unlikely that he could have envisaged that one day women would not only be flying his aircraft, but one of them would rank as senior captain. One wonders how an airline pilot nearer home would react if called upon to unload and load the cargo as well as fly the aircraft. But in the Northern Territory, it's all part of the job. Lynn Henneberry is the other member of the all-girl crew, hostess and cargo clerk. Another Heron is stranded on the desert airstrip with a brake failure and overheating engines. The crew consult Christine as the senior captain for an on-the-spot ruling. She advises Bob Foreman, the pilot, to radio Alice Springs, and the problem is relayed to an aircraft engineer over 300 miles away.
Cool somewhat. The pressures are down to about 125.
Understood. You should be all right once you've built up your pressure. All right?
Roger, I'll swap the brake lines over but I would prefer to remain on the ground for a while to allow the engines to cool down.
The problem is typical of Connellan's 40-year battle against a climate loaded against man's ability to fly. Aircraft designers before the jet age never looked further than the temperate atmosphere of their drawing offices. Up here in the territory heat, engines seized, petrol vaporized, and propellers stalled in the hot air. Over the centre's 2,000-foot-high plateau, shimmering in the heat, there's that mysterious phenomenon, density altitude, the thin air which makes an aeroplane strangely reluctant to leave the ground. To fly in these conditions, Eddie Connellan became a do-it-yourself designer and an innovator out of sheer necessity. Many of his aeroplanes were modified beyond the designer's wildest dreams.
The Heron was the biggest modification program that we've ever carried out. It was underpowered, like all, as I say, all English aeroplanes of those days were underpowered because they were built for a temperate climate. One English aeroplane that the manufacturer's Miles, who was a great designer, the Miles Aerovan, tried very hard to sell me. I wrote to him and I said, well, if you bring it here on a hot day in the middle of summer and put it on the bitumen north of Alice Springs with a full load, and if you can get it off the ground by the time you get to Tennant Creek, 320 miles away, I'll buy it. And I wasn't taking any risk at all because it was so underpowered. But the Heron was underpowered. The Queen 30 engines were supposed to be 250 horsepower, but they lost power very rapidly with temperature and with altitude. And a Heron with a full load with Queen 30 engines required, technically by the charts, 5,000 feet or more of runway to get off on a hot day in this area. And you just don't have 5,000 foot strips around on stations, 3,000, 4,000 feet. So then I looked around for something else and I decided that the best engine in the world of its size, the straight, ungeared, unsupercharged Lycoming, was the engine to build it around. Then I went around the world trying to find somebody interested. But at the same time, I had to get the Havilands interested because no one could attempt this job without the blessing of de Havilands. They'd have to have all the drawings and design data of the aeroplane. And de Havilands wouldn't give it. I met the designer of the Heron, a man named Herod Hemswell, a very nice gentleman, but he was adamant that this couldn't be done, that if you put more power in the Heron, it would fall to pieces.
But Connellan had a great deal more confidence in the British Heron than its designer. He persevered and finally convinced de Haviland that they'd produced a better aeroplane than they realized. Before modification, each Heron was re-sparred, which means replacing every structural stressed member reposing out of sight within the aircraft's skin. 1,000 skilled man-hours go into each wing. Such a task would daunt many a well-equipped aero manufacturer in more temperate latitudes. But to attempt it in 2 hangars in the middle of a desert with 1,000 miles of nothing in any direction was a brave decision indeed. Four powerful engines are installed, up-to-the-minute navigation and autopilot equipment fitted, and the new Connellan Heron is reborn, 12,000 miles from home.
Well, the performance of the converted Heron, the Lycoming Heron, briefly, is that with the Lycoming engines, its aerodrome runway length requirement on a hot day with a full load here is reduced from 5,000 feet to 2,400 feet. Its cruising speed is increased by 35, 40 miles an hour without any increase in its fuel consumption. And because the engines are lighter, its payload is increased by as much as 800 pounds, or alternatively its range. It can carry a full load of passengers and freight for very long range compared with the original Heron. It's a very fine aeroplane. In fact, I would think that the Lycoming Heron is the finest aeroplane in its class in the world today, and it should be put back into production. In fact, I think could put some sector of the British aircraft manufacturing industry back into business.
It's a familiar story, a brilliant British design taken over by someone with the courage and determination to turn it into a world beater. Connellan modified 8 Herons, enough to satisfy the needs of his mini airline. And the cost? The final reckoning shows that each Heron worked out at 2/3 of the price of the nearest comparable aircraft in current production. Another aircraft designed way back in the late 30s and built as a war horse during the 40s was a world beater and still is, the DC-3, the indestructible Dakota. A flying machine of such character and stamina that it survives all over the world, patched up with homemade spare parts. The jet age came and went supersonic, but the old radial engines of the DC-3 throbbing overhead stir memories of dangerous moonlight and a bygone age when the aeroplane was primarily an instrument of sudden death and terrible destruction. That bygone age briefly and tragically returned to Eddie Connellan in one of the most bizarre events ever to occur in Alice Springs. Shortly after the filming of this program, a young pilot with a grudge against the airline deliberately aimed a stolen twin-engined aircraft at the Connair hangars and with the resolution of a kamikaze pilot dived with wide-open throttles into the buildings. The suicide mission was premeditated and planned in detail. Eddie Connellan's son, Roger, the airline's training captain, was killed together with 5 others on the staff. Eddie Connellan lost not only his son, but in the explosion and fire that followed, much that he had built up over 40 years was destroyed. The tragic loss of the young Roger Connellan is a cruel blow to an airline which had already entered its most crucial phase. As a third-level air service serving fewer than 100,000 people, scattered over 500,000 square miles, it can never pay its way without a substantial subsidy from the government. Down below the air lanes, surface roads are improving all the time. In a country where the aeroplane literally took over from the camel, an ironic situation is developing in which motor transport is taking away the profitable business from the aeroplane. Connellan lost £250,000 on the last financial year, in spite of a large subsidy. Should Connellan's airline disappear, the isolated people of the territory would lose a vital service. Like this 1,000-mile DC-3 flight to Darwin, which, unlike the big airline jets, is able and willing to make a diversion to Hooker Creek's dirt airstrip, to drop off much-needed perishable goods and to pick up the odd passenger. The value of such a service to the isolated people of the territory is incalculable, but it will never pay its way. From the early days, Eddie Connellan's motto has been populate or perish. 30 years ago, he wrote, "Connellan Airways is owned and staffed by people who have accepted this challenge. Let all Australians do their part." The camel and the aeroplane typify more than the old and the new ways of life in the outback. The contrast is real enough, and so far as possible, the amenities of civilization represented by the aeroplane must more and more be brought to the hinterland. If you discount Alice Springs and Darwin city dwellers, every other person in the Northern Territory, black and white, has over 10 square miles each to stretch their legs. But Connellan has done more than any other man to bring the amenities of civilization to the new settlers.
I'll go and put these on. See you later.
Yeah, we'll see you sometime.
Yeah, okay.
Bye-bye.
Connellan's airline links the dry centre with the tropical north. By far the largest contingent of Australia's pioneers live in Darwin, the territory's capital. Perched on the northern rim of Australia, it's a lonely town. Its nearest big city, Adelaide, is as far away as London is from the centre of the Sahara. It is closer to Singapore than it is to Sydney. Two years ago, the city was totally devastated by Cyclone Tracy. When dawn broke on Christmas Day, the 45,000 residents of Darwin looked out from the rubble of their homes and found their city in ruins. The cyclone left no part of the city of Darwin undamaged. 90% of all houses were either completely destroyed or rendered uninhabitable.
The central passage with the linen cupboard one side and the wardrobe in the bedroom the other side. So we virtually created a double wall either side by tying the doors together. Carted all the mattresses into the centre of the house and stacked them up round us. The ceiling fell on top of us and just created a cubby house for us.
and we just sat there like eggs in a milkshake.
We were sat in what was remained of the bathroom for about an hour and a half. Tins blowing everywhere. There were about 4 inches of water in the bathroom.
During the following 5 days, nearly 26,000 people were evacuated by air from the ruined city. Connellan's Camels played their part in the massive airlift. It was one of the most extraordinary events in Australia's history.
At all the points that are being set up, register for movement south.
One of Connellan's pilots, John Hanson, recalls his nightmare flight out of Darwin 2 years ago.
There was 2 DC-3s in the Heron going down to Alice Springs, and I was the last aircraft out of Darwin. And we touched down at Tyndall, which was a place where we had to get the fuel up so we go right through. We were met there by a lot of the town people, you know, with clothes, toothbrush and toothpaste, which was probably the most welcome thing we could have had. We then took off from there and headed for Alice Springs, and just out of Tinning Creek we went through a fairly active trough. And we were in that for about the best part of an hour and a quarter, and it's probably some of the roughest weather I've flown in. And, to make matters worse, we ended up with a fairly sick port engine. We burned a hole in our exhaust pipe, and that in turn started burning into the ignition leads. Things was getting, you know, fairly rough by the time we reached Alice Springs.
In the wake of Cyclone Tracy, trees and shrubs were stripped of their foliage, the birds were simply blown away. 2 years after the event, none have returned. The city still bears the scars of its most desperate battle with the forces of nature. All but 5,000 people are back rebuilding their lives. The approach of Cyclone Tracy was accurately plotted for 4 days before it struck the city. Adequate warnings were broadcast over local radio stations, but there's little evidence to show that anyone in Darwin paid any attention, except perhaps Connellan, who got all his aircraft out to fly another day.
A cyclone is imminent. Anything on your property that could be a wind-borne missile, including rubbish tins, outdoor furniture, dead branches, toys and tools, should be anchored or taken inside.
Here, up at the top end, Connellan's planes really come into their own. Nothing much below but tropical swamp and swiftly flowing rivers. The coastline was first discovered by the Dutch explorer Jan Carstens in a ship called the Arnhem in 1623. The whole western peninsula was named Arnhem Land and is now a reserved area for the Aborigines. The Northern Territory's most northerly point and Connellan's furthest port of call, a tropical island paradise in the Arafura Sea. Once a church mission to the Aborigines, Croker Island is now a self-supporting settlement.
When will that ablution block be finished, George?
The men's council sit under a shady tree and debate the affairs of their small community. The sale of traditional handicraft provides a small income to buy the things that they need. Once the sea provided everything, but that was a long time ago. Croker Island is now part of the 20th century. Here at Minjilang, the Aborigines have built their own airstrip. They did everything themselves, except survey the swampland on which it is built. Today, a variety of small aircraft will converge on Croker Island to mark the opening of the new aerodrome and to celebrate a new dot on the airline route maps, marked Minjilang Airstrip. John Hilder, captain of the first aeroplane to touch down, greets the proud chief of Croker Island.
Yes, that's right.
And you built this one?
Yes, our people have worked on it, and they built this airstrip.
The landing strip itself is perfect. The surface smooth and well consolidated. Just the right degree of curvature to ensure good drainage in the heavy wet season rains. It's the beginning of a new era. After thousands of years of traveling by canoe, the people of Croker Island will now take to the air without having seen a train or a bus.
A little bit better than the old one.
Oh, yes, yes. Is it bumpy or not?
Oh, beautiful, just like bitumen.
Oh, good.
Interesting to see they haven't found a substitute for a 44-gallon drum yet, though.
Thank you very much for coming along this morning. We are now going to open this the strip with a word of prayer, and let us come together. Come to the Lord in prayer. Let us all pray. Our God, our Heavenly Father, we thank you that as we come together again this morning and to meet you in this way, there we might find rest in our hearts. We thank you for this special day, for the opening of this new airstrip, and what it meant to our people. Now, God, may we give praise to you.
After the prayer, the feast. The island will never be the same again. Another isolated place has joined the outside world. Whatever the origins of the Australian Aborigine, he is no longer the prehistoric man of the textbooks. No society remains static. The life of the Aborigines has continued to evolve, stimulated by new ideas and beliefs arising from within their own communities. Now the rate of change must increase. Now, for better or worse, the aeroplane will bring to these shores ideas on a scale undreamed of by the ancient people of the Dreamtime. This tiny island symbolizes Eddie Connellan's vision of 40 years ago, that everyone in the territory should share the same access to the amenities of modern living. And it was to make that possible that he made the camel fly.